The Starving of Saqqara by Michael Cisco. I first saw them set off very dramatically in a case set alone in the middle of the gallery floor, lit from above and below, so that the light scoured every trace of shadow from the creased surfaces of the statue. I know I glanced at them as I came in, and then began drifting along the left-hand wall, allowing the framed images there to pass me by. But I wasn't looking at the images. I was too aware of the presence of those two behind me, waiting for the moment when I would turn to look at them. When I did, I couldn't leave them. When the docents announced that the museum was closing, I abruptly turned and hurried away without a backward glance, feeling less embarrassment than shame, as if I'd been caught staring at something I shouldn't have been staring at. My feet ached, my back was stiff. I had been walking around and around the case for hours, it seemed. It was as if seeing them had set off slow music in me, which was gathering force. I went home and looked up images of them. I found a short film consisting of lingering close-ups edited together, fading in and out of each other, set to Debussy's Clair de Lune. What a perverse choice of music, delicate, infused with a sense of discovery. It was meant to invoke images of familiar things, all aglow in moonlight, under your gaze as you rest in a state of tranquil contemplation. You gaze in delight on a transformed world, enjoying an immortal calm that never entirely overcomes the memory of mortal transience. But what are you being shown? Two starving human beings, emaciated, squatting naked on the ground, half buried in clay. There are still some traces of pigment left on them, mainly streaks of green on one of the faces. The bodies were carved from limestone, and in their extreme whiteness they still seemed to be exposed to the glare of a pitiless Egyptian sun. Two bound captives, with ropes around their necks. The back of one figure was gouged with unintelligible writing that no one had ever been able to identify. Their eyes still squinted, their mouths hung open as if they were panting for breath or crying out in misery. Was Clair de Lune selected because, as the camera inched over the surfaces of the huge, elongated heads of these figures, someone had been struck by a resemblance between their powdery, curved whiteness and the surface of the moon? I read that they were only 2 feet tall. To me they had seemed life-sized. One was supposed to be male, the other female, but I couldn't distinguish that between them. Two Ashen figures, half melted into a clay base, hairless, almost fetal figures with stick-like arms and legs, bulbous heads, noses broken away, knees pulled up to their chins, elbows flush to wizened torsos. They sit face to face, a little entangled in each other. One of them keeps its right fist lightly clutched to its breast, while the left hand holds the other by the arm, as though the one figure were trying to comfort the other. So, the statue was showing me a human being reduced to a little more than a skeleton, a dying human being, who nevertheless was able to find in themselves a fleeting surplus, just enough to offer consolation to another dying human being. I learned that the statue had appeared in Canada around 1950 in a collection belonging to some dealers in antique artifacts. No one could account for the name, which associated it with the necropolis of Memphis. The statue, I read, was either a unique example of pre-dynastic Egyptian art or a modern fake. I know nothing about Egyptian art, but the style struck me as modern. It wasn't just the stark contrast between the starving of Saqqara and with its anatomical irregularities, its curious posing, its unhieratic realism, and, on the other hand, the untroubled, suavely poised, and hieratic sculptures I'd seen in the Egyptian wing of the museum. It was the subject matter, above all, that seemed wrong. There were plenty of images of dominated peoples, captives and slaves, but they were always triumphalist caricatures. These figures, as distorted as they were, had too much real humanity. Their suffering was too palpable. This was the kind of art 20th century people make, wasn't it? Unless this was triumphalistic, I refused to believe it. Weren't the cruel caricatures of defeated Nubians a kind of denial, meant to defend the Egyptians against charges of a far worse cruelty? Portraying the conquered enemy as a sort of cartoon creature was a way to avoid acknowledging the horrors that had been and were yet still to be meted out in the course of that conquest, or at least that's what I had assumed. Only a monster would preserve this image of utter abjection in order to gloat over it. Time and again I returned to the images of the statue. The eyes seemed to squint in the sun. The bunched lids are crepey around bleary irises, the skin taut across the cheekbones, the teeth exposed, the withered lips drawn down in a fixed grimace, a hare lip-like snarl, the mouth agape almost like a trumpet, strong chin unlike the receding chin of the other, both with overhanging brows and gauntly tall cheekbones. It's as if one of them were speaking, with that open mouth, the fragment of tongue remaining to it, speaking very matter-of-factly, perhaps babbling, driven insane. The traces left by the hollows of the nostrils contribute to the impression that the noses were not broken away, but that the image depicts two people who have had their noses sliced off. I found other images of starving people in Egyptian art, but in all of them the figures were bas-relief carvings of people with drawn but noble faces, mouths firmly set, cheeks sunken, symmetrical bands of protruding ribs, full heads of hair, or some covering for the head, with the usual linen wrapper around the hips, and reaching out, making all manner of angular gestures with their lean arms. Nowhere did I see any crouched, cringing figures like the starving of Saqqara. It was as if the sculpture had been formed to give the lie to those other, statelier, or at least more impersonal images. But I couldn't find any way to release myself from the horrifying idea that someone had ordered this statue made as it was, to revel in it. Was this some kind of trophy? The problem with that idea was that these figures were not characteristic enough to be particular people, some hated enemy who had finally been served their due comeuppance, a traitor, a tyrant, a blasphemer. These were nobodies. The whole point, unavoidably, was that these people were just people, any people. When I returned the next day, they weren't there. A terse note had been propped up in the display case. This object is unavailable. When I asked the guard standing in the doorway with a look of philosophical boredom on her face, all she could tell me was, "They didn't bring it out today." So, they took it in somewhere after closing time? Eventually I found a docent who told me that something had gone wrong with the lights that illuminated that particular display case, and the statue had been removed until the lights could be repaired. She had no idea how long that would take. I considered asking if I could see the statue wherever it now was, but the circumstances were so confusing, and I had so many other things on my mind that I didn't manage it. Were they boxed up somewhere, or just sitting out on a table, perhaps just on the other side of that wall? Perhaps I could see them through a window, if they were in the basement, beneath this floor. But would they be stored away as they were? Uncovered? Wouldn't they have to be covered? Especially if they were in the basement, and the basement were as damp as basements usually are. Museum basements may have better climate control, though. Could I claim to be some sort of student or academic, or arrange a private viewing? Perhaps I could pay to see it. I found myself in the gift shop staring at a photograph of them on a postcard. The two figures together in icy blackness, and from far enough away that their anguish was not really discernible. The impulse to buy it nearly gave way to another impulse, which was to pull the sheaf of cards from display rack and rip them to shreds. No one should look at this, or not like this, not on a postcard. It was like playing Claire de Lune, using this image of horrible suffering as the backdrop to "wish you were here, grandma is fine, blah blah blah." The exhibit had been nearing the end of its run. Why had I waited so long to see it? Soon they would be returning everything to a storeroom at Concordia University. I returned every day until I had gotten to know half the staff, it seemed, but the promised restoration never happened. The statue was never brought back out again. The exhibit closed, but I couldn't just leave them there, all alone in some storage area. I had the stupid impulse to loiter around the museum as long as I knew that they were somewhere inside, but of course they could just as readily be stored somewhere else, couldn't they? How could I find out where? I spent much of my scant free time searching for images of them, for writings about them, more to keep in contact with them than out of any desire for knowledge. Knowing things about them was not unimportant to me, but it was only a means to an end. I couldn't leave them. If it weren't for this persistent searching, I would almost certainly have overlooked the news that they had gone missing. No one was prepared to call it a theft, not yet, although that possibility had of course not been ruled out either, not by any means. After the defect in their display lighting had been found, the two of them had been shifted to storage, whatever that means, and then it appears they were never quite accounted for after that. Someone at the museum, a person with whom, as it happens, I had spoken more than once, was quoted, saying that there might have been a miscommunication about the statues requiring restoration or cleaning. It seems that the antiquities at the museum were not kept under constant watch, but were simply set aside, now here, now there, not at random, of course, not by any means, but without the constant supervision that would have, more or less, been their best protection against theft. How could anyone leave them unprotected? How could anyone leave them at all? It seemed to me that all this meant they were still here, somewhere in town. Perhaps not. They might have been taken away, but I would have felt that, I think. It just didn't seem plausible, though, that they, while if not full-sized, are certainly not small, and not especially robust either, I think, could be spirited out of town with any dispatch. I mean, it could be done, of course, but not quickly or discreetly. And where would you send them? Wouldn't it make more sense to keep them here in town, out of sight, for a while? Did I take them? I don't remember taking them. I live alone. It's true I could have taken them if I had known where they were, but of course I didn't know where they were. Where are they now? Did I take them and forget I'd done it? It's possible, but then knowing what is and isn't possible is just a guessing game, and besides, what good does it do me to concern myself with that now? If I took them, then I would know where they are, and I don't, do I? They aren't at home. A painstaking search proved that. I don't know if I've taken them, but I feel as though I have. This feeling is intolerable. It's an intolerable feeling. I can't think or sleep or eat. I jump at every sound. Can't speak to anyone for fear I'll blurt out an incoherent admission or, worse, a stream of false language. It is necessary, absolutely necessary, to do something. They're all out there somewhere, alone, in someone's hands. I imagine them being treated roughly, an arm breaking, and I can hear my own sharply indrawn breath. My shoulders rise, my throat stopping. I have to find them. I was laying flat on my back, dreaming, of course, unable to move in the bed, and they were in the apartment with me, somewhere very near me, and I heard scraping on the floor, steadily nearer. The sheet beneath me was yanked, and yanked again, not hard. I saw the tops of their heads. My head was flat on the mattress, fixed upright, but out of the corner of my left eye I could see the tops of their heads. The bed dipped with their weight. Stiff, dry lips touched my exposed left calf. Little hands gripped my leg feebly, and then teeth sank into the muscle. I screamed in agony. The jaws closed, tugged, tearing the muscle. The pain grew worse and became a sick horror. A shadow came between me and the ceiling. A hard, cold face nuzzled my chin upwards. Teeth cut into my throat. I couldn't scream anymore. I had woken up, alone, unharmed, but unable to breathe. They had been silent, apart from the rustling of the bedclothes as they moved. They were stiff, like wooden figures, and in the dream I had thought the jaws were made of wood and hinged like wooden jaws, and they hadn't been ravenous or hungry or anything, but had acted with a silent and dispassionate automation. They didn't know what they were doing. They were beyond knowing anything, and ate what could no longer nourish them in any way. Silent, numb, and mindless, they had torn into me as if it were all they could do. I spent the day looking for them. The dream had destroyed my appetite. I busied myself looking for them all day long, until I was staggering with hunger. I checked the area in the vicinity of the museum first, not because I expected to find them there, although I couldn't rule out the possibility that the thieves, if there were any, had attempted to hide them in plain sight, not far from the museum, but more so because I roughly knew where they had been kept, and I wanted to plot out the most likely route they might have taken out of the building. I determined that the thieves, if there were any, would have almost certainly parked their van, or whatever vehicle they were using, on the street at a point nearest the best exit, which was not the closest one to the storage area, not by any means, since that exit was pretty exposed to public view at nearly all times, and which, for that matter, had a tall flight of stairs to manage as well. The best exit was one of two service exits at ground level. Both of these were about equidistant from the storage rooms, but one of them opened on a loading area that was overlooked by tall buildings on two sides, lit well at night, and visible from the street. The other exit, however, was tucked away behind a low wall that concealed some of the dumpsters, and which would screen anyone emerging from that exit until they'd traversed about half the distance from the building to the sidewalk. There was no fence there either. If, for example, a van had been parked adjacent to that exit, someone, that is, a pair of reasonably strong persons, could readily carry even a large object from the exit to the van and load it up in less than a minute. And it was a one-way street, so it was possible to trace their likely route as far as the corner. From there, the choice was obvious. A right turn was impossible. That street was one way too. A left turn would involve circling the museum and entering a neighborhood with virtually no through traffic, since it was a sort of promontory thrust out into the bay. The van must have gone straight ahead. That meant they were heading for the highway. If that were their route, then the thieves, if there were any, were long gone and could be anywhere. But wouldn't they have been safer here in town? Was it wise to transport them a long distance, rattling around in the back of a van? The museum couldn't have packed them for transport already. Under those circumstances, that is, if they had packed them, then surely they would know their whereabouts. There couldn't be more than one loading area in the museum, so the two of them must have been sitting out, under a simple throw cover at best. The thief or thieves didn't have time to pack them carefully before they removed them from the building. It was impossible to secure them in the car. The thief, if he wanted to preserve them from harm, stopped somewhere nearby after as short a trip as was consistent with avoiding discovery in order to secure them for a longer trip. For that, it would be necessary to find a place near the museum with a loading bay, or at least a decent-sized entrance off the street, and it would have to be empty. There was no sense in risking discovery, signing leases, and so on. The thing to do was to drive them to an empty building with a loading bay off the street. There had to be a bay because securing them meant crating them, and a bulky crate is not going to fit through an ordinary door. I drove around all day until my head swam, and I realized I was bound for an accident. I kept going and going, circling blocks, feeling sure that, the moment I saw the right building, I would know, but the sidewalks were busy with people. There were lights in all the windows, commerce everywhere, and it was no place for them. Where were they? By the end of the day, I had to pull over. My hands were shaking. What was happening? What was being done to them? They existed. They were lost, in motion somewhere in the world around me, and in danger. Terrible danger. They returned to me again in a dream that night. When I awoke, it seemed as though I'd been dreaming that dream throughout the night, 9 hours of it. They were there, by the window, and the glare of the day fell on them like the heat of the noonday sun, so that it seemed to consume them without reducing them, as if something is cruelly replenishing that incessant loss. I can feel them shrinking from the light, but they are statues, and they cannot move. I'm afraid to move them myself. I imagine breaking one of their arms in a clumsy attempt to drag the statue out of the light, and the figure wailing in helpless agony. After what might have been hours, it occurs to me at last to cover the window, since, now that I think about it, the sun has not budged in the sky all this time. I waste time in a fruitless search for a curtain, a sheet, a piece of cardboard, and in the silence I can imagine their weak voices raised in pain. I feel it in my own throat. I feel the light like acid on my skin. I turn my head, and I am face to face with one of them, staring directly into eyes that seem about to vanish in sheer suffering, my own lips just inches from the gaping, stinking mouth, and I realize that I can't see the other one because I am the other one, and I cannot move, not even to pull myself aside into the shade and out of the searing light of the pitilessly motionless sun. I returned to the area I had scouted the previous day, and continued searching, a region bounded on one side by the street I had first taken, and on the other by an enormous public park. There were plenty of hiding spaces in there, I was sure, but as there were no roads leading into the park, but only surrounding it, anyone with a large object to conceal would have had to carry it in plain sight over broad lawns, or past fountained plazas and circles that are never entirely empty of people. Not possible, of course. Toward the end of a nerve-wracking day of wasted effort, I suddenly remembered, with a palpable shock that, for a moment, I feared might be the beginning of some sort of seizure, that the domain of converted industrial buildings and warehouses I had been searching did not quite end when it reached the park. There was a little more on the far side, between the park and the river. I knew it was the place when the first dingy brick buildings came into view through the trees. There were far fewer people on the street, fewer shop fronts. The streets were in good repair, but empty even of parked cars, and while the buildings weren't dilapidated, they were clearly abandoned. It was as if the place were waiting for the spirit of some new city to wipe it away. I parked my car in the middle of the first block I came to, the only car at the curb on either side of the street. I needed to proceed slowly. I would have to peer in through windows and stare for many minutes at a time into the dark crevasses separating the buildings. I would be waiting, too. It was already late in the day. When the sun set, the night poured into the street, flooded the buildings, and engulfed me. The street lights did not come on. No matter where I stood, I could not see the lights of the city anywhere, and as the stars came out, the same stars that had shone down on them when they were born, when they trembled in the sudden chill of the desert at night, the solitude of the place began to frighten me. The absence of people began to seem like a disguise, hiding the presence of many. I stopped and listened. I couldn't hear the city roar. This was a piece of the city, empty of anyone but me, or so it seemed, come loose in time and drifting in space. I knew they were there, in a pocket of horror tucked away somewhere in one of these dead buildings, behind the pretentiously uncracked and transparent glass of these windows, and screened from view by weather-beaten, strictly regular rows of brick and mortar. It wasn't until I'd slammed myself into my car, with a loud crash that seemed to die away into the muffling air outside, that I realized I'd been unable to stand the exposure of that street at night. It was as if the city were watching me with bated breath, withholding its light, to see what I would do, to see me find them. I couldn't stand it. I had to return home again. Things had changed. It was clear, by the time I'd let myself back in, that things had changed. It was because I had been right. They were still here, in town, and they were there, in that little cluster of empty blocks on the far side of the park. Tomorrow I would go there, and I would find them. That night, I was at the outskirts of the city, consulting with various of my colleagues about some matters of importance involving water, irrigation. Our formal conversation at an end, one of my colleagues starts to press me about something. We are both avidly interested, even obsessed, with art of all kinds, and especially pictorial and sculptural arts. We are men of high rank in this city, so we are sure to be invited when a new statue is presented, or when a carved wall or pillar is unveiled, and in our own modest ways we both collect what we can. Now he has something remarkable to show me, he says, and conducts me to the home of a mutual acquaintance, one of the wealthiest and most powerful officials in all Memphis, and a noted patron of the arts. As we meet with him, exchanging ceremonious words and gestures, I am becoming short of breath, all the blood pooling in my center, leaving my arms and legs weak and cold, and my heart bristles and shakes, because this man is gesturing to the tomb-like door of his home, and I know what's inside, what he is going to show me. It's them, freshly made, fully intact and new, and there is no doubt that I am going to read the words scrawled on them, to be able now to read them and understand what they mean. I am being waved through the door. My friend has my arm. I can't stop walking forward. At any moment, I am going to see them in their entirety. I wake up with a strangled cry, shivering as waves of cold, revulsion, and misery wash over me, nearly crazy with the desire to rip the life out of myself and get out of the world. If I find them, the dreams won't stop, will they? Will they become permanent? The block was just as empty by day as by night, and nearly as silent. I found I could move in and out of the buildings easily. Most of them had no doors to lock. Nothing was boarded up or marked, and being there was like visiting the world after it had ended. I had scaled one building and then a second. I was looking out into a shaft way from the rear windows when I saw the crowns of two misshapen white heads just above the sill of a window opposite. I fly down the stairs, out into the street, which wheels and skates along with me, carrying me to the doorway, propelling me up the stairs and through an open doorway into a vast apartment, the entire floor open, the partitions torn away, all plaster and drywall, and them by the window. "I found you!" I say, rushing toward them, hating the sight of them, but needing to take hold of them, as if I were going to gather them up like lost children, and indeed my arms are nearly entirely around them, when they turn their horror-stricken, imploring eyes to me, and recoil from my touch, shrinking, crying out in pain, in fear, and raise their impotent, shaking hands to beseech me not to hurt them again.